The fluorescent lights of my small apartment felt dimmer than usual as I stared at the email chain that had been growing for weeks. It was the master plan for the return of the prodigal daughter. My sister, Captain Sarah Miller, wasn't just coming home after a 2-year deployment in a high-stakes intelligence zone. She was orchestrating a coronation. Sarah had always been the sun in our family's solar system. Everything and everyone revolved around her gravity. I was just a moon, cold and distant, reflecting her light when she allowed it. As kids, if I got an A, she got a trophy. If I learned a piano piece, she learned the cello. It wasn't enough for her to succeed. She had to be the definitive success story of the Miller household. The email from Sarah was titled, "Welcome Home Protocol, read carefully." I leaned back, rubbing my eyes. I had spent the last 18 months working 14-hour days at a tech firm that contracted for the Department of Defense. It was grueling, sensitive work that I couldn't talk about, not even to my parents. To them, I was just doing something with computers, in a cubicle, while Sarah was out there protecting our freedom. Maya, the email began, stripped of any sisterly warmth. I've coordinated with the public affairs officer at the base. They're expecting a significant press turnout because of the nature of our mission's success. This is a delicate moment for my promotion track. I need the family to look cohesive and professional. I scrolled down. She had attached a literal floor plan of the hangar where the ceremony would take place. There were X marks for Mom and Dad, positioned right behind the podium where she would give her remarks. Then, there was a small, isolated circle near the back, labeled Logistics/Maya. I need you to handle the guest list check-in, she had written in a follow-up message. It's better if you're at the entrance. It keeps the civilian clutter away from the primary photo op. Also, please let's keep the wardrobe simple. Dark slacks, maybe a beige blouse? Nothing that pops on camera. We need the focus on the uniforms and the medals. This isn't the time for your artistic fashion choices. The condescension tasted like copper in my mouth. My artistic choices were just clothes that didn't make me look like a ghost. But Sarah knew exactly how to frame her demands as, for the greater good. She made it sound like my presence in the photos would somehow dishonor the United States Army. I called my mother, hoping for a voice of reason. "Oh, Maya, don't be difficult." Mom sighed before I could even finish my sentence. Sarah has been through so much. She's a captain. This welcome home is a milestone for her career. If she wants the photos to look a certain way, let's just give her this. You've always been our quiet one. Anyway, you don't like the attention. Remember? That was the lie we all told ourselves to keep the peace. I didn't dislike attention. I had just been conditioned to believe that any light shed on me was a light stolen from Sarah. Over the next few days, the messages became more frequent and more demanding. Sarah sent a script for the family to follow if the local news crews asked questions. My section was 3 sentences long, mostly focusing on how proud I was to be the sister of a hero and how I'd been keeping things running at home while she did the real work. She was effectively trying to erase my entire adult life. In her mind, the 2 years she was away were a vacuum for me, a period where I simply waited for her return to give my life meaning again. She had no idea about the sleepless nights I'd spent in secure rooms, the lines of code I'd written that guided the very drones her unit used for reconnaissance, or the commendation sitting in a classified folder at the Pentagon with my name on it. I looked at the beige blouse Sarah had suggested. It was limp, colorless, and utterly invisible. I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just sibling rivalry. It was a demand for dignity. Sarah wanted me to be the logistics coordinator? Fine. I would coordinate. She wanted me to be behind the scenes? I would stay there until the very last second. But I decided right then that I wasn't going to be the civilian clutter she could just sweep under a rug. I closed the laptop, my mind already drifting away from her protocol and toward the reality of what was coming. Sarah was so focused on the cameras she had invited that she completely forgot that sometimes the most important people in the room aren't the ones standing behind a podium. She wanted a military-grade welcome. She was going to get one. But it wouldn't be the one she had spent months rehearsing in her head. I didn't buy the beige blouse. Instead, I went to the back of my closet and pulled out a charcoal gray tailored suit, sharp, professional, and commanding. If I was going to be civilian, I was going to be the most formidable civilian in that hangar. The stage was set. Sarah thought she was the director of this play, but she had no idea that the script had been rewritten by the very person she tried to cast as an extra. The morning of the homecoming was a masterclass in military precision and sibling manipulation. The hangar at the regional airbase was a cavernous space, smelling of jet fuel and floor wax, draped in oversized flags that fluttered in the drafty air. I arrived 45 minutes early, just as Sarah had suggested in her final, all-caps text message. Maya, check the guest list again. The governor's aide might show up. Do not let the local press wander into the secure zone before I land, she had commanded from her satellite phone during her layover. I stood by the heavy steel doors, clipboard in hand, playing the role of the dutiful, invisible assistant. My parents were already there, fluttering around the podium like nervous moths. My mother wore a dress that matched the blue in the flag, and my father kept adjusting his tie, his eyes glued to the tarmac outside. They hadn't even noticed my charcoal gray suit. To them, I was just a functional part of the scenery, the one who made sure the chairs were straight and the bottled water was cold. Then the roar of the engines signaled the arrival. The transport plane taxied to a halt, its massive shadow sliding across the hangar floor. The local news crews, tipped off by Sarah's own PR efforts, hoisted their cameras. The red live lights flickered on, glowing like predatory eyes in the dim light. When the stairs lowered, Sarah emerged. I had to give it to her. She looked the part. Her uniform was crisp. Her medals glinted under the high-intensity lamps, and she wore an expression of practiced, humble strength. As she descended, the small crowd erupted in cheers. My parents rushed forward, tears streaming down their faces, falling perfectly into the photo op Sarah had choreographed weeks ago. I stayed back as instructed. I was the silhouette in the background, the one holding the clipboards and the extra bags. As the initial hugs ended and the reporters began to swarm, Sarah caught my eye. She didn't smile with sisterly relief. Instead, she gave me a sharp, downward nod, the signal to come grab her gear so she could be unencumbered for the interviews. I walked toward her, moving through the periphery of the camera's view. As I reached her, she didn't say, "I missed you," or "It's good to see you." She leaned in, her voice a low, disciplined hiss, and handed me her heavy tactical rucksack and a briefcase. "You're too close to the frame, Maya," she whispered, her smile fixed for the cameras while her eyes remained ice-cold. "Take these and go stand over by the catering tables with Mom. This moment is about the unit's legacy, not family reunions. And for heaven's sake, stand up straight. You look like a disgruntled intern." She literally shoved the heavy bag into my arms, the weight of it nearly knocking me off balance. To the cameras, it looked like a touching moment of a soldier handing her burdens to a loved one. To me, it was a deliberate act of subordination. She wanted me to be her pack mule, a physical representation of her superiority. "Go," she urged, giving me a tiny, dismissive shove toward the shadows. "The Channel 4 reporter is starting the live feed. Don't get in the shot." I retreated. I stood by the long tables draped in white cloth, holding her sweat-stained gear while she stepped onto the podium. I watched through the gap between two camera operators as she began her speech. She spoke of sacrifice and the loneliness of the front lines, her voice cracking at just the right moments. She was good. She had convinced everyone in that room, including our parents, that she was the sole reason the Operation Sentinel had succeeded. From my position in the civilian clutter zone, I watched my mother beaming, her hand over her heart, completely oblivious to the fact that her other daughter was being treated like hired help. Sarah was in her element, basking in the glow of the lens, pointing to her stripes and talking about the technical difficulties of the mission. Difficulties that I knew, better than anyone, she hadn't solved herself. The reporters were eating it up. "Captain Miller," one called out, "tell us about the data breach you intercepted in the 3rd month. How did your team manage to stay online when the entire grid went dark?" Sarah straightened her shoulders, ready to take credit for a miracle of coding she didn't even understand. "Well, she began, a smug tilt to her chin. It was about discipline and refusing to give up on the hardware. I stood there, arms aching from the weight of her bags, watching her spin a web of half-truths. She thought she had successfully sidelined me. She thought that by putting me in the back of the room with the coffee urns and the guest list, she had secured her place as the only Miller that mattered. But as I looked toward the back entrance of the hangar, I saw a black SUV pull up. 2 men in dark suits and an officer with enough stars on his shoulder to light up the room stepped out. They weren't looking at the woman on the podium. They were scanning the logistics area. They were looking for the suit, not the uniform. Sarah continued to speak, her voice amplified by the speakers, echoing through the hangar, blissfully unaware that the clutter she had pushed into the corner was about to become the center of the world. The atmosphere in the hangar was thick with the rehearsed charisma of Sarah's performance. She was mid-sentence, describing the harrowing complexity of the digital blackout her unit had faced, when the heavy side doors of the facility creaked open. The sound was a sharp, metallic intrusion into her polished narrative. First, no one turned. The cameras remained locked on Sarah's face, catching the heroic glint in her eyes. But then, the air in the room changed. It wasn't just the cold draft from outside. It was the sudden, unmistakable presence of authority. I remained where Sarah had discarded me, standing near the catering trays with her heavy rucksack still cutting into my shoulder. From my vantage point in the shadows, I saw them first. 3 men moved with a purpose that made the local reporters look like amateurs. In the lead was a man whose uniform bore the unmistakable weight of 4 stars. General Harrison. Behind him were 2 men in sharp, charcoal suits. Men I recognized from the windowless briefing rooms in D.C. Sarah saw them too. I watched her eyes widen, a flicker of genuine shock breaking through her hero mask. She likely thought they were here for her. Perhaps a surprise commendation to cap off her televised return. She actually straightened her spine even further, her voice gaining a new level of performative vibrance. And that is why the American soldier must always be prepared for the unknown, Sarah proclaimed, her eyes darting toward the general, waiting for him to take his place in the front row of her audience. But General Harrison didn't sit down. He didn't even look at the podium. The reporters began to murmur, sensing a shift in the gravity of the room. One by one, the camera lenses began to swivel. It started with a single freelance photographer, then the Channel 4 crew, and finally the big network feed. They followed the general's line of sight, which was cutting straight through the crowd, past the VIP seating, and away from the decorated captain. The general was heading toward the back of the room. He was heading toward the coffee urns. He was heading toward me. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. My parents stood frozen, their mouths slightly agape as the most powerful man on the base ignored their hero daughter to march toward the logistics girl. I felt the weight of Sarah's rucksack in my hand, a physical tether to the humble role she had forced upon me. But I didn't drop it. I just stood my ground. As the general reached the edge of the catering area, he stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. The silence that fell over the hangar was absolute. Even the hum of the cooling fans seemed to die down. "Ma'am," General Harrison said. The word was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He didn't say it with the casual tone one uses for a civilian. He said it with the crisp, sharp edge of formal military respect. And then, he did something that caused a collective gasp to ripple through the hangar. He snapped his heels together and rendered a sharp, unwavering salute. The 2 men in suits followed suit, nodding solemnly. One of them, a man named Marcus whom I had worked with over encrypted lines for 6 months, stepped forward with a small, knowing smile. "The situation in the eastern sector has been stabilized, Maya," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily in the silent room. The Joint Chiefs wanted to ensure that the person responsible for the Sentinel grid received their due credit the moment the blackout period ended, which, as of 5 minutes ago, it officially has. I felt the heat of a dozen camera lights hit my face. The glare was blinding, a sharp contrast to the beige shadow Sarah had tried to confine me to. I could see Sarah out of the corner of my eye. She was still standing at the podium, her hand frozen in the air, her face a mask of pale, crumbling confusion. She looked small, not like a captain, but like a child who had been caught playing dress-up in someone else's world. "General," I said, my voice steady, stripped of the disgruntled intern tone Sarah had accused me of having. "I was just finishing the guest list." "The guest list can wait," Harrison replied, his eyes flickering briefly to the heavy bag I was holding, Sarah's bag. He frowned, a look of profound disapproval crossing his face as he realized a national security asset was being used as a bellhop. "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about who the guest of honor is today." He turned slightly, signaling to the press. The cameras were now fully diverted. The live feed was no longer focused on the captain's medals. It was focused on the civilian in the gray suit who had apparently been the ghost in the machine all along. I looked at Sarah. For years, I had lived in her shadow, accepting her crumbs of affection and her mountains of condescension. I had let her believe I was nothing so she could feel like everything. But as the general waited for me to speak, and as the world waited to hear about the woman who had actually saved the mission Sarah was so proud of, I realized the shadow was gone. The lights were on me now, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel the need to blink. The silence in the hangar was no longer respectful. It was heavy with the weight of a million unasked questions. The cameras, once Sarah's loyal subjects, were now hungry predators seeking a new narrative. I could feel the lens of the main network camera zooming in, capturing the contrast between my sharp, professional suit and the heavy, dusty military rucksack I was still holding for my sister. General Harrison didn't wait for the press to find their words. He stepped toward the podium, not to join Sarah, but to displace the air of the room. Sarah instinctively moved to the side, her face a ghostly shade of white. She looked like she was trying to blend into the flag behind her, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the wood. "For the past 18 months, the general began, his voice amplified by the microphone Sarah had so carefully tested. "This country has celebrated the tactical successes of Operation Sentinel. You've seen the footage of the units on the ground. You've heard the stories of bravery in the field." He paused, his eyes finding mine in the crowd. But what the public, and indeed many within the service, did not know was that those units were operating under a digital umbrella designed by a single civilian mind. He gestured for me to come forward. I set Sarah's rucksack down on the concrete floor. The sound of the heavy buckles hitting the ground echoed like a closing door. I walked toward the light, my heels clicking with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. As I passed my parents, I saw my mother's hand go to her mouth. My father looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. They weren't looking at their hero anymore. They were looking at a stranger they had shared a breakfast table with for 24 years. When the regional grid was compromised by the insurgent cyber offensive, Harrison continued, the lives of 300 soldiers, including Captain Miller's unit, were effectively forfeit. They were blind, deaf, and stranded. It was Maya Miller, working from a high-security facility in Northern Virginia, who engineered the Ghost Protocol, a piece of adaptive code that bypassed the breach and restored communications in under 6 minutes. A reporter from a national outlet shouted a question. "General, are you saying a civilian directed the tactical recovery of the unit?" "I am saying," Harrison replied firmly, "that without Maya Miller's intervention, there would be no homecoming ceremony today. The medals being worn in this room are a testament to their courage, yes, but they are also a testament to her intellect. Maya wasn't just doing something with computers. She was the lifeline." I reached the front of the room. I was now standing just 3 feet away from Sarah. Up close, I could see the cracks in her foundation. Her eyes were darting between the general and me, her mind clearly racing to find a way to spin this, to reclaim her status. She whispered something, a frantic, desperate sound intended only for me. "Maya, what is this? Why didn't you say? You're making me look like a fool." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the sister who had told me to wear beige, so I wouldn't distract the cameras. I saw the person who had handed me her dirty laundry the moment she stepped off the plane. "I didn't say anything because it was classified, Sarah," I said, my voice projecting clearly enough for the front row microphones to catch it. "But mostly, I didn't say anything because you never stopped talking long enough to ask. The clutter had officially cleared. The men in suits, the federal liaisons, stepped up to the podium and opened a leather case. Inside wasn't a military medal, but the Distinguished Public Service Medal, the highest honorary award the Department of Defense can bestow upon a civilian. The cameras flashed in a frenzied strobe. The narrative was shifting in real time. The story was no longer "the captain returns." It was "the silent architect saves the day." The local news anchor was already whispering into his headset about a national exclusive. My father took a step forward, his eyes moist. "Maya, we had no idea. You said you were just an analyst." "I was," I said softly, looking at my parents. "I was the analyst Sarah told you to ignore." Sarah's face twisted. The humiliation of being sidelined at her own event was merging with the realization that her superiority had been an illusion maintained by my silence. She had spent years treating me like a backup dancer in the show of her life, never realizing that I was the one who had built the stage, wired the lights, and, quite literally, saved the star from a fatal fall. As the general began to pin the medal to my lapel, I didn't look at the cameras. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at the rucksack sitting alone on the floor in the back of the hangar. It looked small. It looked heavy. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who had to carry it. The aftermath of the ceremony was not a burst of noise, but a strange, ringing silence that followed the departure of the press. The hangar, once a stage for Sarah's grand theater, now felt like a hollow shell. The television crews had scurried away to meet their evening deadlines, their memory cards filled with footage of the invisible Miller. I stood in the center of the room, the Distinguished Public Service Medal feeling surprisingly heavy against my suit. My parents approached me with a hesitant, almost shy gait. It was the walk of people who realized they had been living with a stranger. "Maya," my father started, clearing his throat. He reached out as if to touch the medal, then pulled back. "The general, he said you saved them. He said you saved Sarah's entire unit." "I did my job, Dad," I said, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to hit him harder than a long explanation would have. He looked at me, then back at the podium where Sarah was still standing, paralyzed, staring at the spot where the cameras had been. The power dynamic in our family hadn't just shifted. It had inverted. For 2 decades, the currency of our household had been Sarah's service and my support. Suddenly, the exchange rate had crashed. Sarah's service was real, but it was no longer the apex of our achievements. She was a soldier who had followed the path. I was the one who had cleared it when the world went dark. Sarah finally climbed down from the podium. Her boots, usually so rhythmic and authoritative, seemed to drag on the concrete. She walked toward us, her face a complicated mosaic of resentment and dawning realization. She looked at our parents, waiting for the usual rush of coddling. The "Oh, Sarah, you're still our star" speech that usually mended her ego. But it didn't come. My mother was looking at me, her eyes red with a mix of pride and profound guilt. "All those times we told you to be patient with her. All those times we told you your work wasn't as high stakes as hers." Mom's voice trailed off. "It's fine, Mom," I said, though we all knew it wasn't. It wouldn't be fine for a long time. Sarah stopped a few feet away. She didn't look at the medal. She looked at me, her jaw tight. "You could have told me," she hissed, her voice low so the remaining base personnel wouldn't hear. "You let me stand up there and talk about the digital recovery, like I was the one who led it. You let me look like a liar." "I didn't let you look like anything, Sarah," I replied, my voice calm, devoid of the anger I had expected to feel. "You chose to take credit for things you didn't understand. You chose to treat me like a servant the moment you stepped off that plane. I didn't set you up. I just stopped hiding so you could feel tall." I stepped closer to her, leaning in just as she had done to me earlier. "The difference between us, Sarah, is that I was proud of you without needing to be seen. You couldn't even stand the sight of me in a photo." The silence that followed was the finality of an era. Sarah looked away first. She saw her rucksack still lying on the floor by the coffee urns, the bag she had ordered me to carry. She realized no one was going to pick it up for her. Not me, not Dad, and not the press. As we walked toward the exit, the base commander stopped me one last time to shake my hand. I saw Sarah watching from the periphery, standing in the exact spot where she had forced me to wait an hour ago. She was now the clutter in the background of my exit. We walked out into the cool evening air. My parents walked on either side of me, asking questions about the ghost protocol, their voices full of a new, hungry interest in my life. I answered them patiently, but I knew things would never go back to the way they were. The hierarchy was broken. The moon had stopped reflecting the sun and had started burning with its own light. As I reached the car, I glanced back at the hangar doors. Sarah was walking out alone, carrying her own bags, her head down. She wasn't a villain, just a woman who had mistaken her uniform for her entire identity, and my silence for my weakness. I got into the car, the medal tucked safely in my pocket. I didn't need to wear it to know it was there. I had spent my life being the sister who stayed behind, the one who handled the logistics. But as we drove away from the airbase, I realized I wasn't just coordinating the guest list anymore. I was finally the one writing the story.